Hello, everybody. Shavua Tov. Sorry for the delay. Unusually slow internet tonight. Okay, I hope you've had a great Shabbat and Happy New Year. Tonight, I have a sweet teaching that I'm excited to share with you about Devekut. Devekut is an idea that we've talked about for a long time now. Kind of a special word, a special way where in the Hasidic tradition to connect with God. It means to be attached to in a very strong way. Erev Tov to my mom joining us from Florida, and Steve, Erev Tov. So I have it's a small teaching to share with you. And then a story to kind of illustrate it. So, Shavua Tov, everybody. We're going to jump right into it. So, our verse comes from the end of the book of Genesis that we read today, chapter 50, verse 19. Here, I'll read it in our Tanakh. So, Joseph's brothers are nervous that at the end of this whole narrative, now that Jacob has died, their father, Joseph, is going to punish them somehow for the evil that they did to him. So it says in verse 18, his brothers themselves also went and flung themselves before him and said, "We're ready to be your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I instead of God?" That's our verse we're going to look at. So in verse 19, the Hebrew is this: Vayomer alehem Yosef, and Joseph said to them, Al tiro, don't be afraid, ki hatachat Elohim ani, for am I in place of God? Ki hatachat Elohim ani. Shavua Tov Yochev. This word, hatachat, tachat means below, but it's used here to mean in place of. Ki hatachat Elohim ani, am I in place of God? So this is the verse in question. And here's the commentary of the Kedushat Levi. This is what he says about this verse. Vayomer alehem Yosef al tirahu ki hatachat Elohim ani, ki am I in place of God? But Onkelos tirgem, and Onkelos in his Aramaic translation. So this Aramaic translation is about 2,000 years old. It's printed alongside the Torah, in many copies of the Chumash, and Onkelos doesn't translate it in the simple meaning of the Hebrew. The Aramaic translation to this verse says this: Arei dachala dahashem ana, which means instead of saying, "Am I in place of God?" it says, "Behold, I am God-fearing." Like, don't be afraid because I myself am God-fearing. That's the Aramaic translation. And you see, there's it's worth asking the question, as the Kedushat Levi does. Why does Onkelos not translate it? Why is this Aramaic translation different from the simple meaning of the Hebrew? Instead of saying hatachat Elohim ani, am I in place of God? Am I under God? He says he translates his verse to say, I am God-fearing. That Joseph tells his brothers, I'm God-fearing, instead of saying, am I in place of God? So he's going to ask this question. He says, V'hine, lefi hapashut b'pasuk, ein lahavina targum. He says, according to the simple meaning, this translation makes no sense. V'nireh ki haklal. And we see that this is the general principle. Now he's going to tell you why it makes sense. Ha'adam b'chol midotav sarich lehidabek atzmo lahaborei. A person in all of his or her characteristics needs to attach oneself to the Creator. Baruch Hu, blessed be that Creator. B'midat hayira, in that aspect of fear, liro et Hashem hanichabad v'hanora, to fear God or to be in awe of God, the awesome one. B'midat ahava, in the characteristic of love. Le'ahov et Hashem hagadol. But to love God and God's greatness, but midat tiferet, in the aspect of beauty. Shikuyam banu Yisrael asher becha et pa'er. So we can uphold the verse which says, Israel, in you I will be beautified. V'chen bishar hamidot. With every other characteristic, we need to connect ourselves to God. V'zehu olam ha'emet. And this is the true world, he says. And this sounds like another drash just about Dveikut, but we're about to get, I think, an interesting understanding of Dveikut that we didn't have before. It's coming up. But I want to point out that, yes, the Kiddush HaLevi talks about Dveikut a lot, and this special way of connecting to God. It's almost like he feels like you can't teach it enough. And I think that's his understanding here. He is that people, his students, back in the 18th century, he felt needed to hear it over and over again, that this is the way to connect to God. And we're going to see why right now. Why, in what way is Dveikut juxtaposed to other ways of relating to God? So he said, just to recap, that in all of one's characteristics and all of the aspects of life, we need to connect it to God. V'im tavin ze, and if one understands this, tavin ma'amar chachmeinu, we will understand the statement of our sages. Atidin malachei hashare lomar lifnei hatzadikim kadosh. In the future, the angels will say before the righteous ones kadosh, instead of Jews praying together and saying, holy, 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 in emulating angels. Angels will call us holy. People who are reaching out and connecting to God in this special way. If one connects all of one's characteristics to God, as hu eno tachat Elohim, then he is no longer under God. Adarabah, hu davuk b'Hashem. No, on the contrary, this person is connected to God. Ve'im chas v'shalom, and if, God forbid, eno medabek atzmo b'hamidot kenizkar la'ayil, if one doesn't connect oneself with those characteristics mentioned above, as hu tachat Elohim, then he is below God. Zehu haremez mashe tirgem Onkelos, and this is what Onkelos hinted to when he translated Joseph's statement. In the Hebrew was hatachat Elohim ani, am I in place of God? Also, because tachat means underneath, you can read it as, am I under God? V'chi ani tachat Elohim, and I under God? Adarab, on the contrary, ani davuk b'Hashem, I am connected to God. And this is why Onkelos translated it like this. I am God-fearing. I connect all of my characteristics to God. May God be blessed. So, to recap his explanation of the discrepancy in this ancient Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, he says it's like this. In the Hebrew, it says that Joseph says, Hatachat Elohim ani, am I in place of God, or rather, am I under God? And Onkelos translated as saying, I am God-fearing, implying that what Joseph is really saying is, all of my characteristics I connect to God, and I am not under God, because I am davuk, I am connected to God. Okay, did Onkelos, in his Aramaic translation 2,000 years ago, really intend this? I don't want to say probably not, but probably not. But it doesn't matter, because the Kiddush HaLevi is using it as a chance to teach this very important principle about the Dveikut, which is being connected to God is the opposite of existing within a hierarchy with God. What do I mean by this? We often imagine God as, we use the words, Melech Malchei Hamlachim, King of Kings, sitting on a throne. And like a king who is, above in status, than a normal person, so too we, the Kedusha Levi would say, we get tripped up in this idea of being under God. God is above, we are below. God is in heaven, we're on earth. God is king, I am a servant. God is great, and I am, like every other human being, imperfect. But when one is connected to God, there is no above and below, because there's an understanding. There's an understanding that we are connected, part of God. That God is not above or below us, because we are connected to that. There is just one. There is only one. Our soul connected to God, not above or below, but part of the whole. In this way, we are not below God. Rather, God is part of us. Jay, you say that's a tough one, Rabbi. You can connect to God through your characteristics, but we'll still be under God. The punchline of the old joke is, get your own dirt. We can't do everything God does. This is true. God is, much more powerful than us, in the sense that God, by the way, God is, God's characteristics are ineffable. God is infinite. But there's a part of us, and the goal of Dveikut is to connect oneself to that infinite, and to not get bogged down in the feeling that God is so distant, so above us, that we don't connect at all. We don't uplift that part of our soul that is that is pure and connected to God. Instead, we see ourselves below and God above, and that is, I think, what he adds here in this text about Dveikut. It's an important reminder that when it comes to this special way of connecting to God, it takes away that hierarchy. I mean, what it does is it reminds you that those parts of God, those holy, pure parts, are within us too, and we can connect to it if we just intend it. Now, I want to also share a story with you about what it looks like to connect those midot to God. What did he mean by saying in all of one's characteristics we connect to God? I think there's some very practical advice from, we're going to take a short detour from the Kedushat Levi to Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk is a very late Hasidic rabbi, 1787, died in 1859. For context, the Kedushat Levi was born in 1740 and died in 1809. So Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk was a kid when the Kedushat Levi was alive and teaching. Let's see, Yochev, I'll translate that in a second. And my mom, Elaine, you said the idea being that the capacity to connect takes away that hierarchical nature of things. Yes. And I want to remind you, remember, I've taught multiple times this story about a king who builds a magnificent edifice of walls and gates and a magnificent castle where one can travel to see the king. And this is the story where you have multiple bags of coins at each of the gates, and there's only a limited number of people who have the capacity to get close to the king. And at the end of the story, this is the story from the Baal Shem Tov that we talked about a lot, the punchline of that story is the person who does have the capacity to overcome their banal desires for money and fame, sees the king and discovers that it's all an illusion, that there is nothing but the king. And in that sense, that is what we're talking about here as far as this hierarchy. Where when one connects to God in this special way, there's an intuitive, ineffable understanding that there is nothing but God. that this separation is illusory, let alone the hierarchy. I'm going to share this teaching from Menachem Mendel of Kolsk. He says, Reb Mendel once asked a chassid whether he had ever seen a wolf and had taken fright at the sight of the wolf. Said the chassid, "Indeed, Rabbi, I have seen one, and I was sorely afraid." The rabbi continued to ask whether at the time he was conscious of his fright. The chassid answered, "Rabbi, in my great alarm, I did not even know that I was afraid. I could not even account for my own feelings." Then Rabbi Mendel said, "Even so should be the degree of one's fear of heaven. One must be so frightened and overcome with awe of the Holy One that one is not even conscious of the fact that one is afraid." Here, what Menachem Mendel of Kolsk is teaching his student is how to connect the aspects of his student's life back to God, to take the fear and awe he had in this experience and use it to deepen his dveikut, his attachment, his connection to God. And that's what the Kedusha Levi was saying when he says you take love and then you apply it to God. You take the fear you feel and you apply it to God. You say, in the same way that I was in love in this moment, my soul yearns for God. In the same way that I was in awe in that moment, I am in awe of God. In the same way that I experience beauty in this moment, so too there is deep beauty in God. When one is constantly taking the experiences of life and then reapplying them to their relationship with God, that is the spiritual work that leads to strong dveikut, a strong attachment to God. You'll have your comments. The internet is unusually slow tonight, so this may take a second. Okay. Almost there. Yochev. Okay. Here we go. Yochev, you say, thanks to our characteristics also being a means of approaching God, the important thing is to be connected and does not depend on above or below. Yes, that's his idea here. It doesn't depend on above or below. And then you say, as we have the spark of God, this is our anxiety to connect. For now, this is not 100%, but it will be. And to distance the eternal in heaven and us on earth only brings us difficulties to approach. Yocheb, I don't know if you were referring to, our eventual death, but I think there is, some comfort in dveikut in one's lifetime when one is approaching the end. The idea that one has prepared oneself for the idea of being part, losing one's distinct separation, which is to say our body, and being part of a whole is powerfully comforting toward the end. I also want to, in terms of a great metaphor to that, I like to think of the body as a bubble and, the airspace inside as the soul, the part that is distinct in the bubble, but you can't see it. All we see is the external separating barrier, which is really very thin, but, still it's thin and it's temporal. And then ultimately when that bubble pops, there's a discovery that what was inside the bubble is really part of what was outside, though only to a greater, nearly infinite extent. So I'll challenge you this week as we begin our new year. To work on your dveikut a little bit. When you only even a couple of times, if you have an experience that that you find, you know, it touches on the love you feel or the fear you feel or even something beautiful or something strange. I don't know. Try to connect it back to God and see how that works in your relationship with God. And then do so not with the intent to to connect to God above. Do it with the intent to connect with the God who is right here, with the God who encompasses everything, who we are just um, a small piece of, an offshoot of that oneness that is God. So, with that, no above or below, all one. Um, work on Devekut. I'll just stay for another minute or so in case there are any more comments or questions. All right, everybody. Erev Tov, Shavua Tov, Happy New Year. And next week, I'm excited to begin the Shemot. By the way, what this means is we have studied the whole book of Genesis through the eyes of the Kedusha Levi. Of course, there were more comments in here than we studied together, but I'm excited to jump into Shemot and to see the difference, see how these concepts are illuminated through an entirely different lens, an entirely different story. So with that, Shavua Tov, and looking forward to learning next week. Okay, bye, everybody.